Zoom. We're going to get started. My name is Michael Bayer, and I serve as the Director of Evangelization and Adult Formation here at St. Clement. Thank you for being with us. In a moment, we'll introduce our speaker, but the first thing I'm going to do is go over a little bit of Zoom etiquette for anyone who's with us on the Zoom call. We are going to keep everyone on mute for right now, just so that we can make sure we can hear our speaker. And then we're going to unmute folks during the Q&A, and we'll have a chance to submit questions through the question box. We're going to begin with an opening prayer, but before we do that, if you're still getting used to this whole virtual format, if you go up to the right-hand corner of your box, you will see a little button that says either speaker view or gallery view. If you like the Brady Bunch style, people all over the place, you want gallery view. If you'd rather see the person who's speaking front and center, then you're going to want to click on speaker view so that you can see our speaker, Dr. Matthew Cressler, up close and personal tonight. So first thing we're going to do is go to an opening prayer, and I'm going to invite our young adult board member, Libby, to lead us in that. One sec, once I find her.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Libby. Thanks so much.
Okay, sure.
Okay, let me get the prayer up on the. Okay, go ahead, Libby.
Okay, in the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. Let us not rush to the language of healing before understanding the fullness of the injury and the depth of the wound. Let us not rush to offer a Band-Aid when the gaping wound requires surgery and complete reconstruction. Let us not offer false equivalencies, thereby diminishing the particular pain being felt in a particular circumstance, in a particular historical moment. Let us not speak of reconciliation without speaking of reparations and restoration, or how we can repair the breach and how we can restore the loss. Let us not rush past the loss of this mother's child, this father's child, someone's beloved son. Let us not value property over people. Let us not protect material objects while human lives hang in the balance. Let us not value a false peace over a righteous justice. Let us not be afraid to sit with the ugliness, the messiness, and the pain that is life and community together. Let us not offer cliches to the grieving, those whose hearts are being torn asunder. Instead, let us mourn Black and brown men and women, those killed extrajudiciously every 28 hours. Let us lament the loss of a teenager dead at the hands of a police officer who described him as a demon. Let us weep at a criminal justice system which is neither blind nor just. Let us call for the mourning men and the wailing women, those willing to rend their garments of privilege and ease and sit in the ashes of this nation's original sin. Let us be silent where we don't know what to say. Let us be humble and listen to the pain, rage, and grief pouring from the lips of our neighbors and friends. Let us decrease so that our brothers and sisters who live on the underside of history may increase. Let us pray with our eyes open and our feet firmly planted on the ground. Let us listen to the shattering glass and let us smell the purifying fires, for it is the language of the unheard. God, in your mercy, show me my own complicity in injustice. Convict me for my indifference. Forgive me when I have remained silent. Equip me with a zeal for righteousness. Never let me grow accustomed or acclimated to unrighteousness. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, Libby. So we're going to admit a few more folks into our conversation, and we're going to introduce our speaker. So thank you again, everyone, for being here this evening. Our speaker tonight is Matthew Cressler. And Matthew was born in Connecticut, grew up in Alabama, went to school in New York, Boston, and Chicago, and considers himself an East Coast itinerant. He teaches courses on African American religion, race and politics, Black nationalism, religion in America, and theory and method in the study of religion. He holds a bachelor's from St. Bonaventure University in New York, a master's in theological studies from Harvard Divinity, and a PhD in religious studies from Northwestern University here in Chicago. He is the author of Authentically Black and Truly Catholic, The Rise of Black Catholicism and the Great Migration, released by NYU Press in 2017. So, Matthew, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me, Michael.
So, you were born in Connecticut, you have roots in the South, you've been here in Chicago, you've been a little bit all over. Tell us a little bit more about how you became involved and attuned to issues of racial justice.
Sure. I just wanted to start by saying not just thank you to you, but thank you to everyone who's here. I know I always start with a hey y'all, because I'm at least like a decent amount Southern. I know you can't like say anything back to me, but it's good to be with you virtually. And to be, I guess, back in Chicago virtually, where I spent, a good 8 years of my life, my beloved city. There are lots of ways that I could answer the question of how did I first become attuned to racial justice, racial injustice. But one thing I've been thinking about a lot lately is that really my first memory of what it meant to me and to my family to be Catholic was being with my mom and dad who were engaged in prison ministry in Danbury Federal Penitentiary in Connecticut. It's like one of those things where it's hard to tell if it's a memory or the photo that makes the memory, but I remember, such as one does, being in a circle, holding hands and singing songs with people I didn't know. I remember my parents hosting the children of incarcerated women who had nowhere else to stay when they were visiting their mothers. So this is like a really early memory, talking like, I don't know, would have been like 4, 5, 6. Had never heard the words mass incarceration or racial justice, was not thinking critically about racism. But that for me was kind of the bedrock of the Catholicism that I was raised in. And so that I like to think back, I like to think of that as kind of through my mother and father imprinting on my soul in some way. And so then it was really the story from there on of a variety of different teachers, literally and figuratively. So my undergraduate history professor who brought me and some other students to Selma, Alabama for the 40th anniversary of the March over the Edmund Pettus Bridge. My advisor, Susan Abraham, who's a feminist, post-colonial liberation theologian, who I like to say took me apart brick by brick and built me back up. So I had a number of people who taught me, and I'm kind of in their debt, and I am who I am because of them, I guess. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. So the first part of our talk tonight is the myths of white innocence. And we kind of came up with that title, you and I, because in 2016, you wrote an article for Slate magazine, which we'll put in the chat box here, called What White Catholics Owe Black Americans. And in it, you state, I'm going to quote, "There are certain myths about American Catholicism, stories white Catholics have told and continue to tell themselves, that have aided and abetted attempts to exempt us from complicity in racial injustice in the United States." End quote. And one of those being, quoting you again, the idea that Catholics can be absolved of this original sin of racism because most Catholics immigrated towards the end or after those 250 years of slavery, end quote. So you point to the fact that many of us are descendants of Irish, Italian, Polish, German immigrants who didn't enslave anyone themselves. In fact, my I remember my grandmother showing me photos of one of my relatives who lost his arm fighting for the Union and was imprisoned in a Confederate camp, and that was a source of great pride for her. And hearing stories about no Irish need apply, so we hear this a lot. This is what we've been told. What are the myths that white American Catholics have been told that make it seem like, well, racial injustice wasn't our fault?
Right. This is one of those like, oh, let us count the ways kind of questions. Like there are lots of things we could say. First thing that I kind of comes to mind is that like that's my family history too. So like I'm the grandson of first generation Italian Americans. My mom recalls learning about kind of the Civil War and slavery as a child and thinking to herself, taking great solace and thinking to herself, well, that wasn't my people, right? My people were in Italy. So that's kind of the story that it's kind of like deep in my bones as well. And the thing, so that piece for Slate was originally a talk I gave at my alma mater for Francis Week. So a talk I gave at St. Bonaventure, which I called The Catholic Case for Reparations. And I've given talks about reparations and racial justice a lot since then. And some version of that question some version of that response almost always comes up in conversations about reparations. Well, I don't owe anything because my people had nothing to do with that. And I'm never quick-witted enough in the moment to say this, but since I've been reflecting a little bit, I'll say like one reflective thing that I've been wondering is where that impulse comes from, right? Like, so you imagine you're sitting in an audience and you've been hearing someone talk about kind of this long legacy of white supremacy and enslavement and genocide and injustice and say, we need to do something to repair this. And the instinct often from white Americans generally and white Catholics in particular is, wait, not me though. Like, I don't have to do that. It's not my people. It's not my history. And so like one question we could just maybe start by asking is to kind of like flip it back and say, what are you afraid of? Like what is it about the call for reparation, the call to make kind of material repair for injuries? What is that? What is it about that forces you into that reaction? And I think this is maybe something we can talk about later, but I think it's something similar. It's like a kind of echo of what happens when someone says Black Lives Matter and the response is, well, all lives matter, right? I think that there's a kind of synergy between those two responses. Someone said, I'm talking about racial injustice. Someone says, well, I'm Irish Catholic, or I'm Italian. I'll say my family. I'm Italian Catholic. My family comes after that. I don't owe anything. So there are a few things that we could say, myths that we could bust about that, right? So first of all, maybe we should note that Catholics and the Catholic Church were actually engaged in the enslavement of human beings, right? So the Catholic Church sanctioned, Catholics participated in and profited from the enslavement of human beings, of Africans and their descendants, right? So this is not something that is somehow abstract or metaphorical. Catholic orders of women, religious orders of priests were among the largest enslaving property holders in the Americas. So that's the first point, right? Just a historical.
My alma mater, Georgetown University, only exists
right.
to this day because they enslaved and sold human beings. Right?
Exactly. So that's like the first point, right? Second point, so we could say, okay, maybe let's just leave that aside, right? Your family came after the Civil War, like you're not specifically kind of like, you can't trace your descendants back that far here. Even with that, the United States as a nation state was founded on the institutions of enslavement, settler colonialism, the kind of genocide, both literal and cultural both physical and cultural of Native American populations. So Georgetown's a great example, right? So you're an alum of Georgetown. Georgetown wouldn't exist if it hadn't sold those 272 enslaved people, in 38, or the year that it was. I'm forgetting the year. So the same could be said of all of us who are in the United States right now. The United States would not exist were it not for the enslavement of human beings, settler colonialism, the removal of native peoples from their lands, right? So to the extent that anyone, white Catholics included, participates in the privileges and power that comes from being in the United States, we are all, whether we like it or not, kind of complicit in that, right?
Right. So
That's the
that gets
second
to
point.
the kind of point, like the distinction between, okay, well, I'm not personally harboring racist thoughts. So are you calling me a racist? That kind of
Right.
distinction that we began to touch on last week between individual prejudice versus systems of white supremacy that benefit people who look like you and me,
Right.
even if we came from immigrant backgrounds.
Right. Yeah. I mean, sometimes I talk to my students about it. This isn't my language, but I'm drawing it from other scholars about the accidents of birth, right? Like, I didn't choose to be born into this particular body in a particular time and place. Whether, that's immaterial, right? I inherit the power of a white male straight cisgendered body in this particular time and place, whether or not I want to, right? And so that's kind of going back to that point about, like, why do we react the way that we do? I think part of the way that people react and get defensive, white people, white Catholics, is because, and I don't take this lightly, I do think it challenges our sense of who we are. It challenges our sense of our identity, right? We have a sense, white Catholics, white Americans have a sense of their own innocence, right? That we didn't have to have anything to do with that, right? And so when someone says, actually, you are complicit in that, actually, you have invested in that, whether or not you wanted to, it can shake our sense of ourselves. James Baldwin talks about, it's as if, if white people were to wake up to, this history that they've tried to forget, it would be as though the sun and the stars were shining at the same time. It would be so shattering that it would kind of wreck our entire sense of our own identity. So yeah, absolutely. And so the other point I was going to make, right? So the Catholic Church was engaged in and invested in enslavement. All people who are part of the United States, to some extent, are kind of standing on the kind of inheritances of that history. But lastly, like, this is the point I like to make, and it comes from my research, like, we don't need to look back to enslavement to see the ways that white Catholics and Catholic institutions have participated in, maintained, helped construct and reconstruct white supremacy. We can talk about that in the present moment. We can talk about that 50 years ago.
Right.
Like,
I was reading In the Color of Law by Richard Rothstein that in the 1920s, the pastor of St. Anselm Parish here in Chicago actually organized a door-to-door drive for parishioners to knock on the doors of fellow white Catholics, opposing any non-white individuals living in their all-white neighborhood because it would be a threat to the safety of their daughters. This was a Catholic pastor organizing this. So to that point, I think a lot of us, I'm going to show a picture that I think we have a lot of Notre Dame alums at St. Clement and here in Chicago. A lot of people have seen this photo, this kind of iconic, Father Ted Hesburgh, president of Notre Dame, standing arm in arm with Martin Luther King, and we think that was the Catholic legacy of the civil rights movement, right? We had priests in their collars boldly proclaiming, we are literally linking arms with our brother. But your research, you've seen that there was not unanimous support for the civil rights movement among white Catholics. In fact, I think you may even have dug up some letters that were written to the Archbishop of Chicago when Martin Luther King came here. Can you tell us a little bit more about the role white Catholics played in keeping Chicago segregated and their response to the civil rights movement?
Yeah. No, I was smiling because that's like the biggest understatement, right? That white Catholics were not all marching in the civil rights movement. Yeah, I think that for obvious reasons, historians, scholars, ordinary folks have focused a lot of their attention on the Hesburghs of the story, right? Like, so have focused a lot of attention on the exceptional white and Black Catholics who engaged in the civil rights struggles of the 50s, 60s. And I say, like, exceptional both in the sense that they were actually, like, you know, they were engaged in some exceptional work, but also that they were the exceptions to the rule. You know, if we're talking about white Catholics, North and South, East and West, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, we're talking about people who were either engaged in, not all, but the majority of them, were either engaged in active resistance to efforts to desegregate American society, or they were attempting to avoid the question, right? Or to resist the efforts that would desegregate society. So for instance, in Chicago, you had some white Catholics who, when Martin Luther King is marching with you know, community organizations from Chicago through Marquette Park to challenge residential segregation on the southwest side of the city, you have droves of largely white Catholics pouring out of their homes to fly Confederate flags, to shout white power, to violently kind of accost these civil rights protesters, some of whom were Catholic. So you have those folks, and they may or may not be, you know, it's hard to quantify what percentage those folks made up, but you also had plenty of people who were in the suburbs, in other more distant neighborhoods, who might have disapproved of the violence and the kind of outward virulent racism of the people who were throwing bricks at nuns, but nevertheless were saying things like the church should stay out of politics, the church shouldn't be engaged in civil rights, the church shouldn't be supporting Martin Luther King because he's a communist and he's this radical, right? So my current research has spent a lot of time thinking about, or I discovered these boxes and boxes and boxes of letters written by white Catholics from Chicago who are really, really angry, ashamed, disgusted at what they took to be the Archdiocese's support for the civil rights movement. And part of what my research time is spent thinking about these days is trying to get us to think about that as telling us something, as teaching us something about what it means to be white and Catholic in America, instead of just kind of writing those people off as bad Catholics or people who weren't Catholicing right? Which is how we often tend to imagine this. Yeah.
So you found these letters. So it's possible that there were members of St. Clement Parish or Holy Name Cathedral or some of these parishes in Chicago who actively were not just not marching with Dr. King, they were actively saying to the Archbishop, this is not something Catholics should be supporting.
Yeah, no, I mapped them out because Google, right? So I have these, you know, hundreds of letters, and I, with the help of some research assistant, my research assistant at the time, Annie Rona, shout out to Annie, we tagged each letter with the addresses and mapped them in Google Maps. And yeah, I in preparation for this conversation, I found a letter, I mapped it out, like written from an address that was a 9-minute walk away from St. Clement on Lincoln Avenue. Another letter that came a kind of 14-minute walk in the other direction. These letters really range. So some of them were kind of rapidly racist, capital R, in the way we tend to think about racism. So meaning using racist epithets, kind of demonizing civil rights activists and Black people generally. But a lot of them were, I think, what would be better categorized as kind of white liberal racism, right? So not using racist epithets, not engaging in kind of overt demonization, but kind of expressing outrage and a shame in the Archbishop for supporting Martin Luther King, saying I'm not going to give any money to the church anymore, saying I'm going to stop attending, right, or I'm going to leave my parish. And so I often, this is maybe a weird pivot to make, but when the grand jury report, the Pennsylvania grand jury report came out around sex abuse, and there was a lot of talk, kind of rightly so, of people saying like, this is it, like I've got to leave this church. One of the things that I was thinking about is that actually, like, one of the moments in which you see lots of white Catholics and saying, that's it, I'm going to leave my church, was in this moment in the 60s and 70s where they see the church supporting desegregation and saying, you know what, I can't be a part of this church if it's going to support these people, right? If it's going to support Black people, equality for Black people, civil rights struggles. If this is the church, this isn't my church, right? That's what you see lots of white Catholics saying at the time.
Right.
Again, sometimes like kind of capital R racist, but other, a lot of times kind of in more subtle and kind of proto colorblind kind of ways.
Right. Well, and it gets to the point that depending on the poll, anywhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of white Americans at the time of Martin Luther King actively opposed the civil rights movement. So we all like to think we'd be on the right side of that history.
Right.
But one of the myths is that statistically speaking, 3 out of every 4 of us would not have been if we had been living at the time. So I want to pivot at this point because up to this point, we've been talking about some of the myths that underpin the kind of the white innocence idea. But the second half of your book, which I happen to have right here on my bookshelf for anyone who is looking for a read about all of this, Authentically Black and Truly Catholic. The second part is to say the history of Black Chicago is also the history of Catholic Chicago. And you've documented that, but you begin with the Great Migration, which some people might actually not be familiar with. Can you give us a little overview? What was the Great Migration?
Yeah. Oh man. Thank you for the plug. I appreciate it. Yeah, it's hard to overstate the significance of the Great Migrations for U.S. American history, period. So the Great Migrations was a moment that stretched, I say moment, it stretched for decades, right? That started in 1915, thereabouts, continued all the way to 1970. And it was a mass movement of Black people from largely the agricultural South to the urban North, Midwest, and West. And it was for a variety of different reasons, as you can imagine, the multitude of motivations that go into families choosing to leave their home. But for Black people who are living under apartheid segregation in the South and under the threat of lynch mobs, it was often kind of, it's being framed by historians increasingly as an experience of being a refugee, right? So leaving a kind of kleptocratic, oppressive state in search of not just kind of economic opportunity, but political freedom, social freedom. When they get to cities like Chicago and Detroit and Oakland, they're going to find, of course, that they're going to face a kind of different kind of segregation, a different kind of form of white supremacy. But we could talk about lots of different cities, but in Chicago was really one of the most significant kind of destinations for African Americans migrating from the South, and it transformed the city into the Black metropolis, or at least parts of the city into the Black metropolis in a matter of years. So we're talking like hundreds of thousands of people coming from the rural South to Chicago in decades, right? This is what, when I say you can't overstate its significance, this is, gospel music is born of the Great Migrations. Entire kind of political machines are born of the Great Migrations. And as my book argues, and it's sitting behind you, it transformed Chicago from a Catholic metropolis, or as a city that was largely a Catholic metropolis, into a city, into a totally different city. And Catholics who at that point were not entirely, but were largely the descendant of European immigrants, chose to respond to African American migration in different ways. So the book focuses on Black Catholics particularly. So I'm focusing most of my attention on the handful of white priests and sisters who decided to welcome African-American migrants into their parishes in an attempt to save their dying churches. But the majority of what, you already said this, right, with the story from St. Anselm. I mean, the majority of white Catholics and their priests and their sisters either left their parishes entirely and said, we're going to move to another place, or they fought kind of figuratively and literally on the front lines of resistance.
But despite this resistance, as you chronicle in the book, the Black Catholic community in Chicago begins to cultivate this, as you say, authentically Black and truly Catholic. Where does that phrase come from, and why is that so important?
Yeah, the phrase comes from the pastoral letter, What We Have Seen and Heard, which was published by the 10 Black US bishops at the time in 1984. And it was their, I think, really beautiful and poetic way of saying that Black Catholics could be fully themselves as Black people and fully themselves as Catholics simultaneously. So that statement comes out in 1984. In a sense, my book is kind of tracing the history of how that comes to be, because when African Americans are migrating to Chicago in the 20s and 30s and 40s, that's they're migrating to a Catholic Chicago prior to the Second Vatican Council, to parishes that are largely kind of defined by kind of German and Polish and Irish and Italian kind of liturgical styles and religious life. And tens of thousands of African-American children, women, men are going to become Catholic in that context, in that pre-conciliar context, largely through Catholic schools, through their kind of education in Catholic school systems. And it will only be with the kind of inception. I mean, this is a bit of a simplistic term, but we've only got so much time on a Zoom. It's largely going to be in the Black Power era, where a totally different kind of understanding of what it means to be Black and what is possible as a Catholic, that a kind of transformation happens, and what it means to be Black and Catholic becomes kind of something that's up for debate and really becomes well, authentically Black. And
so yeah,
Catholic.
so about that, you have a subheading in your book that says, what does Vatican II have to do with Black Power? So what does Vatican II have to do with Black Power, and what does the Black Power movement have to do with the Catholic Church, particularly here in Chicago?
Yeah, so for the theology heads, like that subtitle was like a play on like, what does Rome have to do with what is that classic theology? My theology professors are gonna dog on me. What does Rome have to do with Jerusalem? I think it is. So Vatican II is happening in the mid 1960s, and what I argue in the book is that for Black Catholics, for African Americans, their experience of the Second Vatican Council is shaped by this political, social, and cultural revolution that's happening in the US. So rather than think of Vatican II as this kind of esoteric debate that's happening amongst these clerics in Rome, and then kind of being kind of instituted from the top down on people, the way ordinary folks experience the Second Vatican Council is in their own lives, right? Like, what does it mean to go to Mass? What does it mean to engage in religious life in my parish? What does it mean to pray in my family? For African Americans, and I'm focusing mainly in Chicago, but I also spend some time thinking nationally, this takes on a whole new kind of meaning, because you have a revolution in what it means to understand oneself politically, socially, culturally as Black that's happening at the exact same time, right? So you have Malcolm X founding the Organization for Afro-American Unity in 1964, in the midst of when the Second Vatican Council is happening, right? You have the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense being founded in 1966, right after the council is closing. Kind kind of calls for Pan-Africanism and kind of connecting kind of, cultural identities to a kind of broader Black Catholic diaspora is kind of happening at the same time that the church is starting to allow for more kind of experimentation in enculturating masses. So that's what I think Black Power has to do with Vatican II. I'm forgetting exactly how you flipped the question around, but I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, well, so there was a specific iteration of it though here in Chicago at St. Dorothy.
Oh, right. Yeah. So then, and this is what I spent a lot of the time in the book talking about, is you actually literally have Black Catholics engaging in Black Power activism in the late 60s. So in the aftermath of Martin Luther King's, I mean, it's quite eerily similar actually. So Martin Luther King is assassinated on April 4th, 1968. The mayor of Chicago, who was Richard Daley, who is of course an Irish Catholic mayor, orders his predominantly, overwhelmingly white Irish Catholic police force to shoot to kill people who are looting in the kind of uprisings that occurred after King's assassination. And that kind of, both the assassination and the kind of repression that followed led Black Catholics, priests, sisters, brothers, lay people to, in April 1968, declare the Catholic Church as a white racist institution, and to start engaging much more directly in Black Power activism. So it looks like different things in different places, but in Chicago, you literally had Black Catholic sisters, priests, lay people allied with Fred Hampton and Bobby Rush and the Black Panther Party in Chicago, and really fighting for Black Catholic self-determination. So the struggle kind of started in Chicago in 1968 as a struggle to make Father Clements, who's a popular Black associate priest at St. Dorothy Church at the time. It was a movement that started as a movement to try to make him into the pastor, and the Archbishop at the time, who was autocratic, kind of said, put the kibosh on that. There's a whole power play. It's really exciting history. But what that eventually leads to is not just a struggle for this one priest to become a pastor, but a struggle for Black Catholics to control the parishes and schools in their own communities. And so what eventually happens at the end of this struggle in 1969 is not only does Father Clements become pastor of Holy Angels, but you have Black priests, I forget the exact number, but like 8 or 9 Black priests promoted to positions of power in parishes on the south and west sides of the city.
So to be clear for our folks that are joining us, the first Black priest in the city of Chicago to be made a pastor was in the late 1960s.
No.
Okay.
Well, the exception to that is Father Augustus Tolton, who is in the process of canonization right now. Mm-hmm. But because he was pastor of St. Monica, which was then a de facto segregated parish for the only church that Black Catholics could attend. Actually, that was mixing up some of my parishes. But yes, between then, so Father George Clements was only the second African-American ordained by the Archdiocese of Chicago. Father Rollins Lambert, who preceded him, was engaged in the struggle as well. So I was alluding to this power play, but what happens, don't take my word for it. You can read it in the book. But what happens is the parishioners at St. Dorothy try to make Father Clements pastor. He's already engaged in civil rights struggles. He went to the March on Washington. He marches in Selma in 1965. So they tried to get the Archbishop to make him pastor. The Archbishop says he's too much of a rabble rouser. Why don't I take the only other Black priest who's senior to him and make him pastor instead? And they'll be appeased by just me putting this other Black priest in charge instead of this one Black priest. And so what the Archbishop wasn't counting on is that both of those Black priests ally with one another and a number of other concerned Black Catholics, is what they call it themselves, to kind of widen that struggle into a struggle for self-determination. So yeah, but yes, I mean, like Father Augustus Tolton is a pastor in 1898. So we're talking like the first modern, the first Black pastor in modern or more recent Chicago history. Yeah.
Thank you for that clarification. Yeah, and for anyone who is not aware, Bishop Perry and Vanessa White out here in Chicago are the postulators for the cause of, I think right now he's still at Venerable Augustus Tolton, soon to be Blessed Augustus Tolton. Final question, and then we're starting to line up some questions in the chat box. And if you have a question for Matt, please submit it in the chat box and let us know so we can line it up and we can start to have more of a discussion. So final question. So you've studied the history of all this stuff. Do you see any parallels, and this is going to be kind of an obvious one perhaps, but do you see parallels between the way white Catholics responded to the Black Power and Civil Rights movement in the 1960s to what you're seeing many contemporary white Catholics say in response to the Black Lives Matter movement?
That's a great question. It's actually making me think. Did you see my thinking face for a second? I think I might answer it slightly differently now after the George Floyd and Breonna Taylor uprisings than I would have a year ago. So I'll start with how I would have answered a year ago. Yes, I think that the history of the Black Lives Matter movement that's born really in the aftermath of Trayvon Martin's murder and Michael Brown's murder and so many others is going to be condemned by most white Catholics, right, to put it mildly. White Catholics, like other white Americans, are going to kind of retort, all lives matter. They're going to resist Black Lives Matter as too radical and too, as extremist, right? And so I think that if you'd asked me a year ago, I probably would have said, yes, I think the reaction of white Catholics now to the Black Lives Matter movement is pretty analogous to the response of white Catholics to the civil rights movement, which is to say the response is either kind of outright condemnation, disgust, and anger against it, or at the very least, a kind of like, we shouldn't mix politics with religion in that way, a kind of white liberal racist kind of response. I'm not going to go like all hopeful, but I do think that there seems to be, I mean, and conversations like this one are telling, I think. I mean, I do think that for a variety of different reasons, the moment that we're in right now, the moment kind of that follows Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and George Floyd's deaths, has the makings of a different kind of story. By no means does that mean that like what I look out and see now is like the vast majority of white Catholics marching in the streets and engaged in the work of racial justice. But I do think that, I mean, when you have a bishop kind of taking a knee and holding a sign that says Black Lives Matter 2 years after the US Council of Bishops published a pastoral letter ostensibly on racism that didn't mention the word Black Lives Matter once, that seems to be a change. But so I can't say that I'm hopeful knowing the history of white Catholics and the history of the United States. But I do think my answer now is surprisingly different than it would have been if you'd asked me a year ago.
Well, thank you for that. I think all of our speakers have expressed a healthy dose of cynicism mixed with the hope that is not naive optimism. We Catholics profess a belief in the theological virtue of hope, which is not the same as naive optimism. But since you mentioned history and future, I want to do a quick plug for our final Theology on Tap next week, which is with Sister Anita Baird, who was the founding director of the Office for Racial Justice here in the Archdiocese of Chicago. And believe it or not, the Cardinal Archbishop of Chicago in 2001, Cardinal George, was actually using this term that has become very popular recently, anti-racism. In 2001, Cardinal George wrote a pastoral letter that called on Catholic parishes to be doing the work of anti-racism, and Sister Anita was the first head of the Archdiocese of Chicago's task force doing that. So we're going to hear about what the Archdiocese has been trying to do, and then ask her, all right, you've been in this for a long time. What do you think the future needs to look like? All right, so we're getting some questions.
She's a
now
luminary, by the way, I'll just say. I mean, she's like, yeah, I'm so excited that you guys get to spend some time with
her. You're batting third and she's our cleanup.
Yeah, that's good.
So first question is from a young adult named Sarah, who asks, can you clarify what you mean when you say Black self-determination?
Yeah, so in the Black Power era, so here we're talking about in the 60s and 70s, self-determination, well, I won't even qualify it. You know, when we say self-determination, I think what I'm trying to mean is the power and resources necessary to control the destinies of your own community. So the Black Power era in the 60s and 70s, Black power activists were really kind of speaking of cynicism and hope. You know, I think by the late 60s and early 70s, having seen the kind of violent response that civil rights activists were receiving, many activists said, you know what, like what we really need is not new laws to be passed. What we need is power and resources. We need to be able to make decisions for our own communities. We need to be able to determine the destinies of our own communities. So kind of, on the one hand, kind of that's a move to say, you know, we're pretty doubtful of the possibility of white America kind of redeeming itself to the point where we can live full and flourishing lives. That move is also a hopeful one to say, so what are we going to do? We're going to rebuild our own communities and dream of worlds kind of possible outside of white supremacy. So that's still, I mean, so that's a kind of, I think, general enough understanding of self-determination. So it's not necessarily separatist. It doesn't necessarily, so to maybe dispel another myth, the Black Panther Party in Chicago was not a separatist movement. Actually, far from it. Fred Hampton, who is the kind of young revolutionary leader of the Black Panther Party in Chicago, founded the original, what he called the Rainbow Coalition, which was an alliance of white, Puerto Rican, and African-American radicals in Chicago. So the Black Panther Party is an example of an organization that was fighting for self-determination, but wasn't nationalist or separatist in some of the ways that we sometimes think self-determination means. It can mean that, but it doesn't always mean that. Yeah, that's a great question.
Thank you. So for our next question, we are going to go to a friend of mine who's joining us from North Carolina, Lauren Green, the longtime director of the Office of African American Ancestry down there in Raleigh, North Carolina, that knows a thing or two about race relations and segregation. So Lauren, please.
Thanks, Michael. Matthew, I have a question, and it's about how do we go about making our predominantly white parishes more welcoming, given that most African ancestry people do not belong to predominantly Black parishes, especially in places outside of big urban areas like Chicago, DC, yep. Atlanta. Yep. So what is it that we can do to make our parishes more welcoming to Blacks and other non-white Catholics?
That's a great question, Lauren. And hi from the other Carolina. Nice to see you across the line. Yeah, that's a great question. You know, a few things come to mind, and I of course have as many questions as I have answers, but you know, I think that one of the biggest things is that I'm trying to think of how to articulate these things, right? So one of the biggest things I think is that white Catholics, like other white Americans, are so well conditioned to be innocent, right? Meaning to be ignorant, to be totally kind of oblivious to, willfully so, issues of racism and racial injustice, especially in their own communities. And so I think part of the work of this, like this kind of a forum is essential, right? You need to have leaders, and here I don't just mean priests or religious, I mean kind of parish leaders who are willing to prioritize and name as a priority racial justice as kind of essential to what it means to be Catholic. And then for that to be a kind of platform for education and then action, right? So I think that so long as Catholic churches and Catholics think about reproductive health as being part and parcel of what it means to be an engaged Catholic, but racial justice as politics that shouldn't enter into our church life, then we're not going to be able to kind of make Catholic parishes welcoming places for all Catholics, Black Catholics in particular, right? I think that it gets to the heart of those things that we were talking about as kind of myths of innocence, right? That white Catholics have for so long thought of themselves as the representatives of what it means to be really Catholic, the representatives of what it means to be authentically Catholic, that they can't even fathom other ways of being Catholic. And I don't just mean other liturgical ways. I mean also just like ways of being, like in one's body, right? So that's, I'm going to stop because I'm starting to get a little abstract, and I'm hearing in your question like something really concrete. But I think that I kind of, to be honest, like I think a big role is white Catholics engaging in the education of their fellow white Catholics in the way that I'm very fond of a moment in Malcolm X's autobiography where he said, a white woman comes up to him and says, what can I do? And eventually he kind of like after the fact says like, well, you should go back to your own communities. So I think that is one way, and I had another way and it slipped me, but I'm going to keep.
Well, it's funny, Matt. So two things. One is that I'd really recommend to everyone who wasn't able to join us last week, our presenters last week, Darius and Sister Moonbi, actually addressed that very question, I thought, extremely well, which is to say, first of all, reach out and ask, how can we be involved in a relationship, and how can we commit to this being a relationship and not just a one-time thing?
Yeah. That was the other thing. So that reminded me of the other thing I was going to say, which is that, so this is clearly not where your question is coming from, Lauren, but a question that will often come, I think, from people who think of themselves as well-meaning white liberal Catholics is, how can we bring more people of color into our communities, right? Like, how can we, we're such a white space, how can we do that? And I think that the problem when a lot of white Catholics engage, kind of even well-meaning white Catholics engage in this work, is they engage it from a place that assumes that everything will stay the same, but there will be people who look differently in the space, right? An unwillingness to change what it actually means to kind of live out what it means to be Catholic. And I think that that's part of what has to be a part of this, right? And it goes back to what Michael was saying, and maybe kind of echoing from the last week, that in my what I try to do in my teaching and in my writing and research is I try to center Black voices, Black Catholic voices, and also kind of Black voices that aren't Catholic, and allow those voices to reveal and illuminate and unveil the whiteness of the space as it exists, right? And I think that that's something that has to happen on the parish level too. And I think that white Catholics are going to have to, and this is difficult, and this is why a lot of people would rather just kind of read a book and go home and return to their life as usual, is it's going to both cost something materially and also require you to be changed and for your institutions to be changed. Like, so
right. Are we willing
your
to
church,
consider non-Eurocentric music? Are we willing to consider non-Eurocentric worship and things like that? I want to say, we got a question in the chat box that's really fascinating, because somebody said, Lauren, what do you think predominantly white parishes could do? Lauren, if you have any insights, we'd love to hear it. I might have to, sorry about that. That's the downside. Yeah. So.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay. So after spending my whole life Black and Catholic, I guess I do have some perspectives on this. And I think really it does take, it's a collaborative issue, but unfortunately, it's one of these things where, at least in the parishes where I've been a parishioner, it's going to take a lot more of my Caucasian brothers and sisters being willing to accept a change, being willing to work to become more welcoming. I know here that there are several parishes that are predominantly Caucasian as far as the people that attend on Sunday, but they're sitting smack dab in a Black community. And the people that come to church will not make any overtures to the people who literally live right next door to the church.
Yep.
And so welcoming community means, you would not think of doing that and not welcoming your neighbor that live next door to you, but we find that as acceptable Catholic behavior. And so if we want to have welcoming church, then we have to change our approach. We have to think about, we have saints that are from across the globe, and depictions of the Holy Family that are from across the globe. But you walk into any Catholic church, even those that are predominantly Black or Latino or Asian, and Jesus, Mary, and Joseph look like they just came from Ireland.
Yeah.
And so, we have to be willing to embrace a holistic view of what it means to be Catholic. And I don't know if my Caucasian brothers and sisters are willing to see Mary without blonde hair and blue eyes. I don't know if they really are willing to have Vacation Bible School and invite the children that are recently arrived from Mexico or from Nigeria, for that matter, or from the Philippines to come be part of that. Although many of these children that are coming from all over the world are Catholic.
Are Catholic.
Well, and to that point, thank you. First of all, thank you. Our conversation is so much enriched, and it means so much to me to see your face, Lauren. To that point, I'm actually going to go to one of our presenters from last week who can speak to that. Mumbi, you've got some thoughts on this.
Yes, but I also wanted to ask a question, and thank you, Matthew, for everything you've shared. When I look at the civil rights movement and the apathy of most of the white Catholic Church, and I look at the current times we're living in and the same apathy, the marked difference for me is that at that point, Catholicism was still on an even footing in this country, and it did not have the resources it has at this point. So the white Catholic Church has reached a point where it has money to back political candidates.
Yep.
It has money to create all these alternative news sites. And as we see, there's a major Catholic broadcasting network who has kind of decided who should be elected as the next president and are putting a lot of money behind that. And even though Catholicism might be perhaps a dying religion amongst the youth, we live in a capitalistic world, and so it's a money game. And it's just not this effort to influence politics in this part of the world, but it's globally. And we see this when you're on Catholic social media, and you look like when this 2 synods have gone on for youth and the Amazonian Synod, and all the statements that went out trying to dictate how a Catholic, authentic Catholic church would look like. Yet the majority of the Catholic population in the world are not on Twitter and social media saying these things. But we do know that our church, money has always played a role in many things that happen within our church. And I wonder whether you're drawing the same conclusions. And as I speak, I'm not American, so mine comes from observing it, from doing a lot of armchair research and talking to people. Is this something that you see to be a real concern?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that. It's wonderful to have you with us too. Yeah, absolutely. As Lauren was sharing that story of the parish, the predominantly white parish in the middle of a Black neighborhood, one of the questions we could consider is, why are they not inviting people who aren't white in to worship with them? Another question we could ask is, how are they investing or divesting from that predominantly non-white neighborhood, meaning financially, materially, right? What resources are they extracting from that community, or are they not investing in the surrounding community? And that's one, so we've talked a lot, I think, in our time tonight, kind of about white Catholics kind of individuals or as kind of small communities, right? Like what are the myths that individual Catholics tell themselves to absolve themselves of the sin of racism? But when we're talking about the Catholic Church and enslavement, we have something real and concrete to talk about. When we talk about Georgetown University, we can say, look, these human beings were actually sold at a profit, and thus restitution is required financially, not just kind of symbolically, though the symbol is important too. And the argument that I've increasingly been, or I've been coming to, the point I've been coming to is exactly your point, which is that we don't have to look back to enslavement, right? The Catholic Church was divesting in schools in predominantly Black and brown communities in cities across the country and investing in segregated white suburbs, right? They were contracting in certain communities and expanding in others, not just symbolically, like materially, right? Just as, so Michael brought up the color of law, right? Like, so just as we can't see the expansion of white suburbs somehow as divorced from the kind of violence and oppression and incarceration and criminalization of quote unquote inner city communities, the same goes for the Catholic Church, right? And Black Catholics, so I'm a historian, so I'm mostly looking at the past, but Black Catholics in the 70s are saying that, right? So you have the National Office for Black Catholics saying, look, when you say you're going to close schools in cities because there aren't any Catholics who are attending, or there isn't any Catholic money to support those communities, what you're effectively saying is that the Catholic Church is turning its back on Black communities. And so what I would really love to see is an extension of some of the really exciting conversations we're having right now about what the Catholic Church kind of corporately, but also Catholic institutions owe as far as kind of restitution and reparation for enslavement. I would love to see those conversations extended to the present, and to talk about, like, okay, well, if we can talk about enslavement, why don't we talk about 50 years ago, 40 years ago, right now, how both individual institutions and the kind of Catholic Church as a corporate entity is, as you say, investing in anti-Black politics and divesting from Black, brown, non-white communities. And I tweeted out at one point, like, could you imagine what our country would look like if the Catholic Church invested in Black lives in the same way that it invests in politics around abortion or politics around kind of contraception, right? I mean, just it boggles the imagination, because you'd have to literally imagine an entirely different church, but that's the work that we're involved in. I mean, you, Lauren, all of us here, like, we have to imagine a new church, right? Yeah, it was great.
inciting stuff on Twitter, Matthew. I can't imagine. So actually, this was perfect because Sister Betty Ann, I believe you have you've done some history. You have something to add, but you have a question directly related to reparations for this conversation.
Yes, I do. I was wondering, after the Chicago fire, the Blacks were pushed further south, and when the rebuilding happened, I believe it was primarily Irish immigrants in Chicago at that point. And they continued to push and push into a very defined area for African Americans to live, which also contributed to the economic inequality, inequity. And I'm wondering if you could comment a little bit on the role that predominantly white Catholic churches would have, what role they should play in terms of reparations to create economic equity greater than it is now, to help lift people out of poverty in the Black community.
Right.
Do you have any comments?
Yeah, thank you, Sister Betty. So I kind of, on a social and political level, my answer would maybe mirror the answer that Lauren gave and some of the other commenters gave on the, as far as the parish level, meaning that, like, I think the first step would not be for, well, there are two conversations, right? The first one would be, are those parishes in relationship with the communities that surround them, right? And if they're not, how can you establish and facilitate that relationship so that it is one that is equitable and reparative, rather than kind of dictatorial, right? Rather than like a kind of the classic kind of like liberal responses, like, well, we know what's good for you, so let us give these things that are good for you. And I think that kind of what Lauren was saying about the parish is the same on this level. So that's one thing. I think the other thing, which is maybe more in a kind of like formal sense, reparations, like presumably like parishes could actually, like, people could research to see what sorts of kind of material, like actual material wrongs were committed by specific institutions, and then reparation, like literal restitution, could be made, right? So I think that those are not mutually exclusive, but like in the same, and I haven't done this research, I'm kind of like, as you can hear, like this is like something that like one of my maybe dreams like would be like what I would do if I had all the money in the world and all the time in the world. But in the same way that Georgetown University can kind of do its due diligence and determine kind of, okay, well, these are the names of the people who were enslaved by our institution, and this is how much money we made in profit on those human lives, and this is how we, you know, we could envision a way in which the Archdiocese of Chicago could do that, in the way that maybe even individual institutions, schools, parishes could do that. But the kind of more, that's maybe a little bit kind of grandiose. There's certainly a lot of legwork involved there. I think on a kind of more immediate level, it's a matter of, our communities in relationship with, our parishes in relationship with the communities that they are a part of, right? Which, and I would say that often they aren't, and that has to be done in a way that privileges and empowers the people kind of in that community, rather than one that seeks to kind of like bestow as a kind of act of philanthropy or charity, right? But that's a really great question.
It is a great question, and I know a lot of folks are a little unnerved by that word reparations, and yet that is a word that we white
Keep
Catholics need to start getting comfortable with, and be in the uncomfortable place of asking what that would look like. And to that point, we don't want this to just be a summer Theology on Tap series. We want to commit our Catholic community to do the long-term work that's going to require sacrifice, and so for that reason, we're working with a number of other local Chicago groups that are doing anti-racism work, including the latest latest chapter of White Coats for Black Lives out of Loyola Chicago Stritch School of Medicine. Jessica Simpson, their new founder and president, is going to do an event with us and some other people who are in healthcare, asking what would the church and Catholic institutions taking seriously the role of racial justice through, a Catholic medical school, through healthcare access in the city of Chicago. Is there a place for us to be looking at affordable housing through some of these universities, things like that? So we plan to address things like mass incarceration, immigrant and refugee rights, all these things as within that window of what do Catholics owe in terms of atonement for past injustices. All right, so I'm going to go to Maggie Melchior, who has a question, and let me just unmute her. And thank you, everyone. We've got great questions queued up. We'll get to as many as we can.
Hi, Matt. This is great. I really thank you for your time in this conversation. My question is kind of a broader one about media use that you touched on a little bit ago, about like in secular media, both in whatever spectrum you fall on or a person watching, but also specifically in Catholic media, like big EWTN or local Catholic diocesan newspaper. To what degree do you think there's this narrative of white persecution, of like, we're the victims, we little Catholics that are getting pushed on by the government? Like, because I hear that narrative a lot in certain circles. And what has that effect been on the kind of larger discussion about like how to address inequality, how to talk about reparations without people freaking out? Like, where the polemic is so polarized right now that I don't know where to even begin sometimes, because like Twitter is just a flame war all the time. And even in big Catholic media that is nationally powerful and has huge lobbying power behind it, I just keep hearing this narrative pushed about like, we're so persecuted, we the church, we the good Catholics. Like, what do we even do with that? And I'm just kind of like so sick of it, I guess.
Yes, amen. Also, Twitter is a doomscape, correct? So yes, so to answer, like, do I notice that? Yeah. I mean, when I don't notice it in America and Commonweal, but in the more conservative Catholic outlets, I think that you see the rehearsal of these myths of white American innocence playing out pretty clearly, and particularly the one about like, well, I'm the grandchild of immigrants, like I don't have any kind of like, I don't inherit any of these sins. Like that myth is really strong in kind of, I see in conservative white Catholic circles. Also a kind of related, I was once my people were once a persecuted people, and therefore like I owe nothing, is another argument that's rehearsed. There's a myth we didn't touch too much on. Side note, like I don't follow that logic entirely, that like I am the descendant of a persecuted people and therefore I am free forever from attending to the needs of the persecuted. Seems like a little bit of a twisted logic, but so I think, I don't have a good answer, but I think that going back to some of the comments that have already been made, that if there was an investment, like there's a reason why those arguments get amplified to the extent that they do. And this is not to say that any one publication or institution could shut down those arguments entirely. But if there was a much kind of more forceful counter argument being made, not by a kind of what is viewed as a partisan publication, but by leaders within the kind of church itself, then that might kind of shift those arguments to be in a more marginal position. Because I mean, I think you're right. Your read is correct, that I think that the kind of culture wars of our broader society have kind of been mapped onto kind of culture wars within the Catholic Church. And so you have, the anti-racist writing happening in places like America and Commonweal, and the kind of myths of innocence being rehearsed and, on EWTN or in First Things or what have you. But and so that, I don't know how to solve that. and I don't know
so
how
Matthew,
to solve that.
maybe if I could, maybe a way would be, we have a question related to kind of the swirling politics as it pertains to our church, from Rachel about, you mentioned that the document that came out from the bishops did not explicitly use Black Lives Matters. So I want to see, Rachel, are you able to ask your question?
I think so. Can you hear me?
I can. Hey, Rachel.
Hi. Well, I was just kind of curious because I'm just trying to remember what I'd read the pastoral letter a couple of weeks ago, and I thought that the letter noted like some things about racial disparities and racial violence and police brutality. I mean, it was somewhat specific in terms of noting some of the problems that we face in our society in terms of race issues. And so I was just wondering, why does not using the exact phrase Black Lives Matter weaken the letter to you?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, it does mention kind of racial disparities and inequities. I think one of the many, so I'm not the only person who's frustrated by the limitations of the document. And there are lots of different critiques that lots of different friends and colleagues could levy at it. For me, that was as you could tell, maybe Rachel, that was the hang up for me, or one of the big hang ups. And the reason it was for me was because so prior to the uprisings in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, we could already say, and I'm willing to die on this hill, we could already say that the Black Lives Matter movement was the most significant and sustained movement for racial justice since the civil rights and Black Power eras, right? So Black Lives Matter is coined by Opal Tometi and Alicia Garza and Patrisse Cullors in 2013. It becomes a hashtag that it kind of explodes, particularly after the unjust killings of Michael Brown and Freddie Gray and Rakia Boyd and so many others, Sandra Bland. So that's alive, right? And this goes back to a point I made earlier, right? Like the Catholic Church, when faced with the devastation and murder, not to mention incarceration and criminalization and impoverishment of Black women and men and children, the church could have said something over and over again, right? It could have made that a priority. What precipitated Open Wide Our Hearts was not the Black Lives Matter movement. It was not the murder of all of those women and men and children. It was the tragedy, the horror of what happened in Charlottesville, and the death of Heather Heyer at the hands of a white supremacist in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2018. And what struck me about one of the kind of limitations of the document for me was that you have a document professing to address itself to racial justice and commit the church to racial justice without actually ever acknowledging the movement for racial justice that is already afoot and has been afoot for years. And on top of that, not only does the statement not use the words Black Lives Matter, the only allusion to Black Lives Matter made in the document is actually a statement that says, and we condemn any attacks on the police. Like we condemn anyone who would demean or do violence to police. And so that was, for me, again, like prior to the George Floyd uprisings, for me, that was a red flag, right? It was, this document is clearly, the crafters of the document are clearly more worried about being seen as on the side of the Black Lives Matter movement, and thus being seen as against police, for instance, than they are with kind of taking a prophetic stand on the side of the most significant and sustained movement for racial justice in our time. So yes, I mean, I think you're right to note that the document does kind of specify different racial inequities and disparities. But for me, this is kind of just connected to a bigger point, which is that and connects to other questions that people have asked, like the Catholic Church as an institution and Catholics as individuals need to be prepared to listen and follow the people who are engaged in this work. And for better or for worse, the people who have been engaged in the work of racial justice in the last decade, not to mention in the last 400 years, have largely not been Catholics. And so that means that we need to be taking our marching orders from those people who aren't Catholics, or at least a lot of them aren't.
It's a good point. Matt, we got 2 more questions.
Sorry, I was a little long.
No. Listen. We know that these conversations are deep conversations and could go a long time, and that's why we don't want them to be one-off theologies on tap. We want to invite people into these conversations, and maybe this is a good moment before our final 2 questions for me to plug. St. Clement is participating with St. Vincent de Paul, Holy Name, and some other area parishes in ongoing collaborative multi-parish work around racial justice. And St. Vincent de Paul is hosting the first round of book discussions about precisely all the stuff we're talking about tonight, what would be demanded of us as Catholics, by using Father Brian Massingale's book, Racial Justice in the Catholic Church, which is the magisterial text for anyone who wants to understand. Yes, it's a must read. And so beginning this Thursday night, St. Vincent de Paul is going to host the first round, but we want people from all of these area parishes, particularly these large influential North Side parishes that do have people that are involved in things like policy and law and actual structures of justice, to be in these conversations. So go to their website or their Facebook page, and then you can also find out about the information in St. Clement's Young Adult newsletter, Plaza newsletter, and webpage. All right, second to last question, Stephanie. Go.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
I can. Hey, Stephanie.
Hi. So this is kind of building a little bit off Lauren's earlier question, but how can we effectively welcome or bring non-white Catholics into a predominantly white parish when we're living in a segregated city, kind of like St. Clement's is, where instead of being a white parish in a Black neighborhood, we're a white parish in a white neighborhood?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So I think that, I think one of the questions is, for me, how do we as a parish and as individual members of a particular parish make decisions that are kind of aimed at dismantling the segregation of our city and our neighborhoods, right? So are we going to church on Sunday and then contributing through our actions, not just as parishioners attending a church, but also as taxpayers and school, people who enroll our children in schools in the area, et cetera, et cetera. Are we contributing to the segregation of this neighborhood and this city? So, I think that one answer to the question is we need to be honest with the ways in which even and maybe most of all that don't seem to be connected to our religious life within a parish. Are we contributing to the segregation of our community? And then I think again, this is kind of echoes something I was saying earlier, I think, in response to Lauren's question, but I think that a question that needs to be asked and wrestled with is, what do we want as a parish? Why do we want it? And are we willing to change? I think that the danger that predominantly white parishes have to avoid is a kind of voyeuristic or consumerist response where it's like, well, we look around us and we're an all white parish and we want to not be all white because being all white is not a good thing. And so how can we kind of like bring people who look different in? I think the question really begins with how are we willing to change ourselves? There's a book, it's not specifically about Catholics, but I think it's really helpful, by Jennifer Harvey, called, yeah, exactly. Someone noted in the comments that would be tokenism, right? If you're just like bringing in people to kind of like change the color palette of the community, right? That's what you want to try to avoid. There's a book by Jennifer Harvey called Dear White Christians. And it's a book I'd highly recommend. And part of what Harvey argues is that white Christians often approach the work of racial justice seeking reconciliation, seeking to kind of resolve the issues of racism and kind of transform their communities into kind of multiracial utopias. And what they should do is shift their mindset from a mindset of reconciliation to a mindset of reparation. There's that R word again. So I think that would be a great, Dear White Christians by Jennifer Harvey would be a great resource for anyone who's in a predominantly white parish who's looking to say, like, look, there are issues in my parish and in my neighborhood that I think we need to be addressing, and how do we go about doing that? But I think that it really is about a willingness to change and to engage in kind of critical self-reflection as a predominantly white parish before you start kind of trying to invite folks in, right? And then in the context of a segregated Chicago, how am I in, choosing where my kids go to school, in choosing kind of where I live, and choosing what I invest in financially? How am I contributing to the segregation of the city, and how can I engage in struggles to dismantle it? That's a great and difficult question.
It's a great question. It's a question that we are going to be considering as a community, a parish community, a city community, and a broader global and national community of Catholics for a long time. And so in order to continue to think about it, we want to find out what already has been the legacy of people working towards this, like Sister Anita and so many others. So we really hope you'll join us next Tuesday. And again, I want to make a plug. If you didn't have a chance, many of the questions tonight about what can we do, and last week's conversation with Darius Villalobos and Sister Mumbi was really focused on the work we need to do to prepare for and implement that. All right, last question. Bring us home, Ian. Hold on, I gotta
Matt, how are you?
What's up, Ian?
So Matt and I went to college together, so I've been having some of these conversations, not exactly these, for the last 18 years, with some breaks in between. But I remember in the Thomas Merton Center having long conversations back.
That's right.
Thank you for your sharing tonight. I always kind of come back to this question. So we recognize that the church is quite imperfect. We recognize the harsh realities of our Catholic history with race. What keeps you in the church? Whether it gives you hope or helps you kind of continue to come back and be part of the church?
That's a great question. I have, I think, for a variety of reasons, as I've kind of grown in the years since college, I have fashioned, in a sense, like I've added saints, some of whom are Catholic and some of whom aren't, who give me life and who kind of ground me in what I take to be kind of what it means to be truly Catholic, right? So to name some of those Catholics, right? I mean, I've been awakened in the past 5, 10, 15 years to figures like Sister Thea Bowman, who's another figure who's up for canonization right now, who embodies a kind of prophetic, who embodies what it means to be a Catholic committed to kind of a prophetic, kind of anti-racist kind of way of being. I, of course, you mentioned Thomas Merton, of course, a hero of mine as well. And a lot of what I take to be my Catholicism is shaped by the Franciscan tradition. So Go Bonas, right? Or grads at St. Bonaventure University. And the Franciscan tradition, as we've experienced it, certainly as I've experienced it, as one that sees a kind of radical humanism at the heart of what it means to be Catholic. And by humanism, I mean a kind of commitment to the beauty and dignity of the human person as fundamental. But I think I've also embraced saints, and this resonates with what I was saying about the church needing to listen to folks outside of the church. Like, I have embraced saints, and I actually have in the background a votive candle to Saint James Baldwin, who here is figured as the patron saint of poets, uncles, and exiles. James Baldwin and Angela Davis and Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. You know, I have embraced a number of saints, some of whom are Catholic, some of whom are Christian, some of whom are not religious at all, who I think nevertheless embody and lived out and articulated that radical sense of humanism, that radical sense of the dignity and beauty and mystery of each and every human person. And so for me, that's what keeps me steadfastly identifying myself as Catholic, despite the fact that the church and fellow Catholics and the world around us often wouldn't see what I call Catholicism as Catholicism at all. But that's me. That's my weird.
Thea Bowman
I like to
keeps so many of us in the church. And
Sister Thea Bowman, yeah. Truly.
If you haven't seen her prophetic speech to the U.S. bishops in 1989, it's available on YouTube. Dr. Vanessa White, she preached on it last summer at our Theology on Tap, and Father Maurice Nutt, who's down at the Institute for Black Catholic Studies, he has written 2 books on Thea Bowman. So recommend you find your local, ideally Black-owned bookstore, not Amazon, and get copies of these books through Liturgical Press. Matt, thank you so much for being here with us tonight. Thank you for helping us go a little bit deeper into the history, but also giving us some work to do. We really want to thank our partner parish of St. Vincent de Paul, Holy Name, and everyone who joined us on the web from all over the country. This is work we're all doing together. And if you have ideas for things that you think we should be doing or speakers we should be bringing in, please let us know. In the meantime, we hope to see you next Tuesday at 7 for Sister Anita Baird. Thank you so much, everyone. And this will be posted on Facebook and YouTube. Take care.
Thank you.